The ink on the divorce papers was still drying when Richard leaned back in his chair, a smug grin creeping across his face. He had won, or so he believed. His fingers drummed against the polished mahogany desk as he stared at the bank statement on his screen, eyes gleaming at the sight of nearly $600 million waiting for him, left to him by his late father, Samuel. "This is it," he muttered under his breath. "I don't need you anymore." The thought sent a thrill through him. No more obligations, no more pretending, just a luxurious, effortless life, one he felt entitled to, one that should have been his all along. Meanwhile, I sat frozen across from him, my fingers tightening into fists as the reality sank in. My husband, no, this stranger in front of me, had never loved me. I had been nothing more than a waiting game to him, a human ATM, just biding time until my father-in-law's fortune fell into his lap. I had seen glimpses of his true nature before, but nothing prepared me for this moment. His cold indifference, his arrogance, the casual way he dismissed my grief, as if my father-in-law's death was nothing more than a transaction completed. Something inside me snapped. "You want a divorce?" My voice was steady, but my pulse roared in my ears. I snatched the papers from his outstretched hand, scrawled my signature across the bottom, and shoved them back at him with a force that sent them skidding across the desk. "Fine!" My eyes locked onto his, my voice like steel. "Enjoy your money while you can." Because what he didn't know yet, what he was about to learn the hard way, was that his victory was nothing but an illusion. "All right, the rest is up to you," I told him. "Yeah, leave it to me," he replied smugly. He offered to send my belongings, and I walked past him, out of the living room, and left the house. I knew my husband would regret divorcing me. Sure enough, he called me later, panicking when I explained that the $600 million was just a fantasy. My name is Eleanor. I'm 45 years old and work in sales. My husband, Richard, is also 45. He used to work in sales, but now he stays at home. There's a story behind him becoming a homemaker, but to explain that, I should start with my first husband. This is my second marriage. My first husband died in a work accident 5 years ago, leaving me a widow. Between life insurance and severance pay, I received about $600,000. Since my first marriage happened later in my 30s, we didn't have any children. I inherited the money along with my ex-in-laws, but they told me, "We're almost 82 years old and don't have much time left, so we don't need it." I couldn't accept that and decided to give the money to my ex-brother-in-law and his wife, who were living with my ex-in-laws. However, they also said, "We don't need much. Since it was my brother's money, you should use it." So they only took a small portion. In the end, after paying a significant amount in inheritance taxes, most of the money ended up with me. Combined with our savings and the fact that I had a job, I became fairly well off by the age of 41. But even with all that, sitting alone at home and looking at the numbers in my bank account, I felt empty. When I came home from work, no one was there, and no one ever would be. The bed beside me stayed perfectly made, just as it was before I went to sleep. The worst part was when I accidentally made breakfast for two. As I took a bite of the second piece of toast, I thought, this must be what it feels like to have a hole in your heart. I really wanted to take some time off, but I had to keep working. So I went back to my job, constantly feeling a sense of void inside me. I desperately wanted someone, anyone, to listen to me. That someone turned out to be my current husband. When I told him about my husband passing away and how I had to take some time off because of it, he said, "I'm sorry for any inconvenience." I quickly replied, No, It was no inconvenience at all. Besides, he continued, your husband was a lucky man to have someone who cared for him so much. I'm sure he was very happy. He then shared a bit about himself, saying, as for me, I'm terrible at relationships. Even when I do date someone, I get dumped quickly. I know it's because of my... Richard had a naturally careless personality, but it seemed hard for him to change who he was. My husband and I were business acquaintances before we got to know each other better. I knew he was a cheerful person, so when I visited his company, I ended up telling him everything. Normally, anyone would find such a dark and heavy story off-putting, but he listened quietly and then cheered me up with some light-hearted jokes. His words and smile seemed to fill a bit of the hole in my heart. He continued to listen to my stories, and we started meeting outside of work. One day, while we were talking, I accidentally dropped a receipt. He jokingly said, "Wow, my wallet is twice as thick with coins. You dropped a receipt." And we both laughed. "I need to organize it, but it's such a hassle," he added. Later, when he tried to pay at a store, receipts started falling out as he pulled out some cash. I picked them up and handed them back to him, and he stuffed them back into his wallet while complaining about the coins. It seemed like the receipts were also making his wallet bulky. "You're like a kid, Richard," I teased. "What? I'm 45, you know," he replied. Just as he said, he was a bit careless, but watching him, I felt the hole in my heart slowly start to close. We kept meeting privately, and a year later, he told me he had feelings for me. It had only been a year since my previous husband had passed away, so I was torn. But I felt like my late husband was telling me, don't stay stuck, move forward. So, I decided to start dating Richard. People around us had their opinions, but making that important decision helped me begin to heal. However, just a month later, Richard gave me an even bigger concern and asked me to make an incredibly important decision. Shouldn't we get married? Given our age, it's better to decide sooner rather than later, he said. This time, I couldn't hear my late husband's voice guiding me. It felt like he was telling me to trust my own intuition and keep moving forward. So, I decided to marry Richard. Okay, let's get married, I said, surprising even myself with how quickly I made that decision. It was likely Richard's personality rubbing off on me. I started to think that a bit of carelessness wasn't so bad if it made me more positive. At the same time, I learned from Richard that too much carelessness could be problematic. Wait, live with your dad? I asked. Yeah, just recently, he got sick and needs help with daily living. He kept working past 73, thinking he was still young, and now this happened, Richard replied. What about your mom? Is she helping him? I asked. Huh? Didn't I mention it? My mom's not around. My parents divorced when I was young, and I haven't seen her since, he said. This is the first I'm hearing of it, I said. Sorry, don't be mad. But it's a heavy topic to bring up when we weren't sure about getting married yet, right? I figured I'd tell you later, he explained. Even if you put off talking about living together, you could have told me about your parents. I would have known that living together might be an option, I said. Well, let's not sweat the small stuff. Just meet my dad and then decide if you're okay with living together, Richard said with a smile. And if I say I can't live with him? I asked. We'll figure it out then, he replied. Richard smiled, but I couldn't smile back. I wasn't planning to say I didn't want to marry him just because I didn't want to live together. I just wished he had told me the important things earlier. I thought being careless wasn't so bad, but now I saw that it wasn't a good thing after all. In the end, I agreed to meet his father, as Richard suggested. Then, I began to understand what he meant by small stuff. Your house is pretty big, I said. Just a bit. It's just me and Dad, so we have some extra rooms. If you move in, you can use any of the spare rooms, Richard replied. I was about to meet his dad for the first time, so I was a little nervous. Ignoring my feelings, Richard opened the gate and walked toward the front door. His house was 3 stories high, slightly bigger than the neighboring houses. Living there with just the 2 of them seemed quite luxurious. That's what I thought, but Richard seemed dissatisfied. Dad's so stingy. He should have built a bigger house, he muttered. I was surprised. It's already big. Why would he need something even larger? Richard shrugged. He's got the money for it. He just refuses to spend it. From what Richard had told me, his father was wealthy but frugal. I couldn't quite understand why Richard felt the need for something even grander, but I decided to hold my thoughts until I met his dad. That day, as I stood in front of Richard's family home, I realized that this meeting was about more than just deciding where we would live. It was about truly understanding the man I was about to marry. Richard had talked about his father before, saying he wasn't the type to meddle in his son's affairs. But I was too nervous about meeting his dad to confirm what he said. Dad, I brought her. This is Eleanor, Richard said. Nice to meet you, I said. Sorry to greet you from bed. It's been hard to move lately, his dad replied. Please don't strain yourself, I said. Richard's father propped himself up with Richard's help. He wasn't bedridden, and it seemed he could get up and walk slowly with some assistance. Despite his physical issues, his father seemed sharper than I expected. So, Eleanor, you're in sales for office equipment. With the move to paperless offices, selling hardware must be getting tougher, right? His dad asked. Yes. Industry-wide, equipment sales have been declining for about 11 years, so everyone is focusing on new services or business expansion, I replied. Considering that the domestic market for equipment is almost saturated, you need to look at countries where there's still demand for new services. IT integration might be the way to go. I think there's something called MPS, right? He said. I completely forgot I was talking to my future father-in-law. The conversation flowed so naturally into work talk that I switched into work mode. His father didn't push too hard on the marriage topic either. He was probably being considerate of my feelings. After just a few minutes of talking, I found myself respecting him. I started to understand why Richard called living together small stuff. He probably knew I wouldn't oppose living with his dad. About 30 minutes into our conversation, his father said, My back's starting to hurt. Sorry to cut this short, Eleanor, but I need to rest. Please take care of Richard. He's quite a chatterbox. Sure, I will, I replied. Is sure the right response? His father seemed to cut the conversation short to avoid burdening me. I wanted to talk more, but I didn't want to tire him out. Feeling a bit disappointed, I left with Richard. On the way back, Richard told me more about his dad. Dad's a serial entrepreneur, Richard said. A serial what? I asked. A serial entrepreneur. He starts companies, grows them, then sells them. He's done it multiple times, Richard explained. You can just buy and sell companies like that? I was surprised. Well, yeah. Selling one company involves millions of dollars. Starting and growing a company also needs a lot of money, so the sale isn't all profit. But still, Dad's pretty well off. He just doesn't like to spend. He could build a mansion that would make jaws drop, but he doesn't, Richard said. Don't you know much about his work? I asked. He doesn't talk much about work or money. He never hired me for his companies or taught me how to make money. Living at home is the only way he spoils me. If he's got so much money, he could spoil me a little more, don't you think? Richard replied. Your dad probably has his reasons, I said. It seemed his father was quite an impressive person. It made sense that Richard might feel overshadowed by him. Given how incredible his father was, Richard probably got compared to him a lot, so it was understandable that he'd have some complaints. "By the way, why did your mom leave? Your dad seems so kind. It's hard to imagine their marriage not working out," I asked. Mom spent a lot and wanted an easy life. After the divorce, people only came after Dad's money, so he decided never to marry again. He focused on work instead. "With that much money, he could have spent a bit, don't you think?" Richard answered. "I don't believe in spending money just because you have it," I said. From what Richard told me, it seemed his mom relied on his father's money, so I couldn't agree with Richard on this point, but I thought his words came from feeling inadequate compared to his father. Later, I talked with Richard about living with his father. His father currently relied on Richard for help and also got assistance from a home helper when Richard was at work. I thought my husband and I would continue working while getting help from a home assistant to take care of my father-in-law. However, Richard surprised me with a different idea. "I want to quit my job and take care of Dad," Richard said. I was taken aback. "Quit your job? But we're both working right now. Wouldn't it be better to hire more help instead?" Richard shook his head. "Dad took care of me my whole life. Now it's my turn. Besides, if I quit, we won't have to worry about paying for a home helper, and I can make sure he's okay." I understood his feelings, but it was a huge decision. "Are you sure? You love your job. Won't you regret it?" Richard sighed. "I can always go back to work later. Right now, I feel like this is what I need to do." I thought about it for a moment. It was true that Richard's father had done so much for him. Maybe this was Richard's way of giving back. Still, I couldn't shake the concern that Richard was making a decision he might later regret. "Well," I said, "if you're sure, then I'll support you." Richard smiled. "Thanks, Eleanor. It means a lot." "What? Quit your job?" I was shocked. Dad's such an incredible person, right? I feel like I haven't done anything for him all this time. So, from now on, I want to support him without relying on a caregiver. "I'll be like a homemaker," Richard explained. "I'll take care of the house, too," Richard said confidently. "Are you sure? You won't regret quitting your job?" I asked. "I'd regret not doing anything for Dad more. I can go back to work after he's gone," he replied with a small smile. "That joke isn't funny," I said, feeling worried. I had thought my husband might resent his father, but it turned out that wasn't the case. Despite everything, he really cared for his dad. "If you're going to be a homemaker, you better handle the housework properly," I warned. "Leave it to me," Richard said, puffing out his chest confidently. Since my father-in-law would cover his own expenses and my income would be enough for the two of us, I decided to leave the housework to my husband. When we got married and started living together, everything went as planned. I worked, and Richard took care of the house. He managed the chores, handled the finances, and supported his dad. When I tried to help, he would say, "You're tired from work. I'll handle the house stuff. You rest." My father-in-law remained kind and shared many valuable stories with me. Our second marriage was going well. However, I noticed that my father-in-law would sometimes frown when he saw Richard doing housework. A month after we started living together, Richard began slacking off with the chores. "You're sleeping on the couch again. You've been there all day, haven't you?" I asked. "No way! I went to the fridge when I was thirsty, and to the bathroom too," Richard said, trying to defend himself. "That's not what I mean. What about dinner? Did you go grocery shopping?" I asked. "Dinner's ready. Don't worry," he replied. I glanced at the kitchen, but there was no sign of any cooking. All I saw was an empty container on the dining table. It was clear he had been lazy all day. From this, I realized what Richard meant by "dinner's ready." Perfect timing. The intercom rang. Richard grabbed his wallet and headed to the door. I was too stunned to say anything. Richard had only handled the housework diligently for the first 3 weeks. After that, he gradually stopped doing anything, and I ended up cooking, cleaning, and doing the laundry. It's typical for someone with a careless personality to start strong and then quickly slack off. Caught up in the excitement of getting married, I hadn't foreseen this. My father-in-law, on the other hand, must have predicted it early on, which is why he frowned whenever he saw Richard doing housework. As my husband began to shirk his duties, my father-in-law started apologizing to me, saying, "That boy is so careless. I'm really sorry, Eleanor. I hoped he'd become more responsible after getting married, but it seems he's just causing you trouble. If he becomes a burden, feel free to kick him out." "I wouldn't do that," I said. "Really, it's okay. I'm sorry. I've tried to correct him, but he's just, well, you know," my father-in-law replied with a sigh. "It's okay, but he isn't neglecting to help you, right?" I asked. "No, he does help me, at least a little," I replied, noticing a slight change in my father-in-law's expression. It was clear that Richard wasn't completely ignoring his father, but he also wasn't doing a thorough job. Still, my father-in-law was probably downplaying the situation to avoid any conflict between us. "I'm sorry," I said. "No, Eleanor, you don't need to apologize," my father-in-law replied, with just one word, "sorry." He seemed to understand what I was feeling. We both apologized, and there was a bit of awkwardness between us. To break the tension, my father-in-law quickly changed the subject with a brighter tone. "Oh, I'm doing some end-of-life planning and need your help. I'm not confident in Richard handling it." "End-of-life planning?" I repeated. "It's not as negative as it sounds. I just want to avoid any trouble later." "Got it. If there's anything I can do, I'd be happy to help." Talking about Richard made us both cautious, so we ended up avoiding discussions about him and housework. It was an uncomfortable way of being considerate, but there were also thoughtful gestures that made me happy. One day, as I walked into the house after work, I noticed my father-in-law sitting in his usual chair, deep in thought. His expression was serious, but when he noticed me, he quickly smiled. "Eleanor, do you have a moment?" he asked. "Of course," I said, sitting down across from him. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. "I want to make sure everything is settled before I pass away." "You're not going anywhere anytime soon," I said with a small laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "I know," he chuckled, "but it's always good to be prepared. I don't want Richard struggling later because I didn't plan ahead." I nodded. "That makes sense. What do you need me to do?" He sighed. "I need someone to make sure my affairs are in order. My finances, my will, everything. I'll help however I can," I said sincerely. He looked at me with gratitude. "Thank you, Eleanor. I know I can count on you." At that moment, I realized how much trust he placed in me. Despite Richard's shortcomings, his father had never treated me like an outsider. He saw me as part of the family. Over time, I took on more responsibilities, handling legal paperwork, organizing documents, and making sure everything was in place. My father-in-law guided me through the process, and though it was daunting, I felt honored to help him. Through it all, Richard remained the same, careless but well-meaning. My father-in-law and I shared quiet understanding, supporting each other in ways that words couldn't express. And in the end, that meant more than anything. "Is there anything inconvenient at home?" my father-in-law asked. "Not really, But the bathroom could use some fixing. I just wanted the water heater checked, I said. However, my casual comment turned into something much bigger. Wait, what's this? I exclaimed when I saw the changes. My father-in-law had contacted a contractor he knew, and they completely renovated the bathroom. Not only were the tub and shower replaced, but the walls and floors were redone with special coatings to resist grime. The drain was redesigned to make cleaning easier. They even installed a bath lift to help my father-in-law get in and out easily. Now I can enjoy a nice, clean bath, and it's easier for me to get in and out, he said. It was an extravagant use of money, and this wasn't the first time a small request had turned into a huge upgrade. I quickly learned not to ask my father-in-law for small favors lightly, yet my husband still called him stingy. I couldn't understand how Richard could see it that way, given how generously his father spent money. Out of curiosity, I asked my father-in-law about his most extravagant spending. "What's the most luxurious thing you've ever done?" I asked. "I started a seafood company in Germany, built the office and the factory from scratch. That cost a fortune," he replied. "A company in Germany? That's impressive. But it was work, right?" "Well, yes and no. I did it because I wanted to, so it was more like a hobby," he said. "Why seafood in Germany? Was it because it was profitable?" "No, I had no knowledge or connections and didn't think about profits. Germany exports a lot of seafood, and we import a lot of it. I love seafood, so I thought I could make money and eat all the food I wanted," he said, looking happier than I'd ever seen him. He must have really enjoyed that time. But if he just wanted seafood, he could have bought as much as he wanted. Starting a company overseas seemed extravagant. Do all successful people think this way? It was a world far beyond the understanding of an ordinary person like me. It made me realize that my father-in-law wasn't stingy. He was just careful about when and where to spend money. My husband just didn't understand that. One day, my husband burst into Samuel's room and vented his frustration at both of us. "You listen to Eleanor's requests, but not mine," he shouted. "Are you talking about the bathroom? You use it too, right? And since cleaning is easier now, it's a big help to you as a homemaker, right? Eleanor gets to enjoy a nice bathroom, and it's convenient for me too. No one loses here," Samuel replied calmly. My husband clicked his tongue loudly and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. "I'm really sorry," I said. "It's fine," Samuel replied. "But why don't you listen to your son's requests?" I asked. "He's like his mother. When he has money, he spends it without thinking. Even with a lot of money, you need to understand its value and how to use it wisely. I've tried teaching him that many times, but he's still the same," Samuel said, his expression turning somber. Since that day, my husband had become even more neglectful. Not only did he stop doing anything around the house, but he also started causing unnecessary trouble. "Whose motorcycle is that outside? Did you buy it? No one else's motorcycle would be here?" I yelled at my husband as soon as I got home from work, but he just sat there polishing an expensive-looking golf club in the living room without even looking at me. My husband had stopped doing housework and started buying whatever he wanted. I wouldn't have complained if he was spending his own money, but he was using my bank account without permission. "You get your requests granted by Dad. Let me have a bit of luxury too," he said, trying to justify his actions. He had been diligent as a homemaker at first, and I hadn't seen this lazy side of him before we got married. It seemed he had been hiding his true self before marriage. I was completely fooled. When we got married, I told my husband, "If my salary isn't enough for our living expenses, feel free to use the money in my account." I had meant it as a gesture of trust, but now I regretted it. When I checked my bank statements, I was stunned. Thousands of dollars had disappeared within weeks. Golf clubs, motorcycles, luxury watches, and expensive gadgets. He was spending recklessly, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, I confronted him. "Richard, we need to talk," I said, placing the bank statements in front of him. He barely glanced at them. "What now?" "You've been using my account for personal expenses without discussing it with me. This isn't what we agreed on." He scoffed. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. You're earning well, and Dad's covering his own expenses. Why does it matter?" "It matters because you're not contributing. You're not working. You're not doing housework. And now you're spending my money like it's yours." He crossed his arms. "So what?" "You said I could use it." "I said you could use it for living expenses, not luxury items." His face twisted with irritation. "What's the difference? We deserve some fun, too." "This isn't fun, Richard. It's irresponsible." For the first time, he had no response. He knew he had crossed the line. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't let him drain me financially. If he refused to change, I would take back control. Little did he know, his reckless behavior had already set things in motion, and soon, he would face the consequences. I took back my bank book so he couldn't use the money without my permission. When I checked it, I saw that he had spent around $50,000 in just 3 weeks. It was an expensive lesson. I couldn't trust him. Naturally, I thought about divorcing him, but I didn't want to leave my father-in-law in his care, so I erased divorce from my list of options. My husband seemed to sense that I wouldn't leave him and became even more arrogant. "Hey, can't you come home earlier? I've been waiting for dinner all this time," he complained, treating the living room sofa like his personal nest and hardly moving from there. Of course, he did no housework at all. What did being a homemaker even mean? I was starting to lose my understanding of it. He had said he didn't want to rely on a home assistant and wanted to be a good son, but in the end, he hired a caregiver again. Honestly, this made me feel better. At least I knew my father-in-law wasn't left to my lazy husband. I decided to avoid my husband as much as possible, thinking, let sleeping dogs lie. With this mindset, the year flew by quickly. Then, a significant event happened for both me and my husband. Thank you for everything. My father-in-law passed away just before turning 81. The time I spent with him was short, but incredibly meaningful to me. It felt like we had spent 11 years together instead of just a few. Even after the funeral, I couldn't pull myself together. I felt a deep void in my heart. As I sat in the living room, lost in emptiness, my husband walked in with a cheerful expression. "Hey, let's get divorced," he said. That single word snapped me out of my daze. He was waving the divorce papers in my face. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a joke. I found Dad's bank account. Guess how much is in it? Nearly $600 million. So this money is all mine. You're no longer needed, ATM. I stared at him, stunned. When Dad collapsed a year ago, I didn't want to deal with taking care of him, so I looked for a wife. I figured you'd be an easy catch since you were grieving the loss of your previous husband. I see. So that's why you were in such a hurry to get married, I muttered. That's part of it. But then I changed my strategy. You inherited money from your late husband, right? You never talked about it, but I figured his retirement and insurance would be substantial. So, I took care of Dad while you acted as the ATM, until he passed away. It was easier than working. Now that Dad's gone, I'm set for a lavish life with his inheritance. Do you think you can get away with this? I asked, feeling my anger rising. Of course. I'm his son, so it's only natural that I inherit his wealth. He worked until he collapsed, and I thought he'd live until 87, but he died sooner than expected." "So I'm lucky," he replied smugly. I realized I was clenching my fists. It was my fault for being tricked into marrying him. I could accept that. But I couldn't forgive him for speaking so badly about my kind father-in-law. I was ready to punch him, not caring about the trouble it might cause later. But then, I felt like I heard my father-in-law's voice saying, "Stay calm." Right. There was no need to do anything rash. "Are you sure about this?" "All right, give me the divorce papers," I said. I snatched the papers from my husband, signed them on the spot, and handed them back. "Thanks for making this easy. I'll file these tomorrow. You can take all our savings. I've got $600 million, so take as much of that petty cash as you want," he said, clearly gloating. "Okay then. Yeah, leave it to me. I'll file the papers and send you your stuff if you want," I replied, walking past him and out of the house. As I left, my anger started to fade, and I felt a wave of laughter rising. My husband would soon regret divorcing me. That $600 million was just a pipe dream. A few days later, while staying at a hotel and looking for a new place to live, my ex-husband called. "Hey! What the hell did you do?" he yelled. I instinctively pulled the phone away from my ear as he started shouting. He sounded panicked and confused. I smirked. "I can guess what happened, but why don't you tell me?" I asked calmly. "When I tried to withdraw money from Dad's account, they said, 'This money can't be withdrawn.' What's going on? There should be $600 million in there," he said, his voice full of desperation. I chuckled. "Oh, you poor thing. You really thought you'd just waltz in and claim all of it, huh?" "What do you mean?" he snapped. "Did you really think your father, a man who worked so hard his entire life, would just leave everything to you without any safeguards? You never once paid attention to how he managed his money, did you?" There was silence on the other end of the line. I continued. "Your dad set up a trust years ago. That money isn't yours. It's protected, and you can't touch a dime of it." "No, that's not possible. I'm his son," he screamed. "Yes, and that's exactly why he made sure you wouldn't waste it," I said, my voice cold. "He knew what kind of person you were, Richard. That's why you're only getting a small allowance. The rest? It's locked away to be used for charity and other causes your father cared about." "You're lying!" he shouted. "Am I?" I said, amused. "Go ahead. Call the bank. Call the lawyer. See for yourself." The silence stretched on for several seconds before he finally exploded. "You ruined everything!" "No, Richard," I said, my voice calm and firm. "You ruined everything." I hung up the phone, leaned back in my chair, and smiled. His voice was full of frustration. "Looks like you didn't know. Since your dad didn't spoil you, you never took an interest in his affairs, right? And he never discussed his work with you," I explained. "Stop with the riddles. There's money, right?" he demanded. "Yes, there's $600 million, but it's collateral, so you can't touch it," I replied. "Collateral?" he asked, his voice shaking. "That's right. The money is in the account, but it's untouchable, like a pie in the sky. Also, that money is about to be used to pay off debts, so it'll be gone soon," I explained. "You're kidding. There's $600 million, and I can't use any of it?" His voice grew quieter as panic started to set in. I knew about the $600 million being collateral because I helped with my father-in-law's end-of-life planning. He had asked me to handle things if anything happened to him. Since he passed away, I was going to use the $600 million to settle his debts. But since my ex suddenly demanded a divorce, I left the paperwork to him, telling him to take care of the rest. "What did Dad do with the $600 million? My ex asked. "He used it for something he loved," I replied. What does that mean? He asked, confused. At over 72, Dad decided his next job would be his last and used his savings for something he truly enjoyed. That seafood processing and distribution company in Germany he always talked about. He trusted the management to locals and planned to enjoy his retirement here. But it was a huge failure, and he lost almost everything. When he told me about it, he laughed, saying it was only natural since he did it without any real knowledge. He had no regrets about where he spent his money. To start that company, he borrowed $600 million, using his savings as collateral, but it turned into debt. So, he planned to repay it with another job. It seemed impossible, but he didn't think so. Even with the debt, he kept enough money for his retirement. In today's world, where many struggle in retirement, that's impressive. However, while sorting out the Germany company, his health declined. When that happened, he renegotiated his repayment plan with the bank. Given his long history of high-value transactions, they trusted him. He told them, "If I can't work anymore, take the collateral." They agreed to a 2-year grace period, after which the debt would be paid off with the collateral if he couldn't work. That year is up, and it's time to settle the debt. So this $600 million is debt repayment money, and will soon be zero? My ex asked, his voice filled with shock. Exactly. Didn't you find another bank account? There should be one for living expenses. Yeah, I found one with $80,000 in it, he muttered. That's money you can use freely. It's your inheritance. 600 million turned into 80,000? Why didn't he prepare more for his retirement? My ex wondered, clearly surprised. I was surprised by the $80,000 too, but knowing him, he probably planned to add more if needed. He seemed capable of anything. And it looks like you haven't checked the will yet, I said. Dad told me he'd leave me about 20%, my ex replied. We're divorcing, so you could contest it as infringing on your rightful inheritance. But I'd like to honor his wishes. I hope you'll agree to the 20%, I said, noticing he was breathing heavily. He thought he'd get $600 million, but the amount kept shrinking, and now he was panicking. Why did he waste so much money? He could have bought anything with $600 million. My ex yelled, frustrated. Yelling at me won't change anything. He was happiest when he talked about that time, so he had no regrets. It was his money, and he used it. He planned to repay the debt himself, so no one can complain. You just jumped to conclusions and got ahead of yourself, I replied. Why are you so panicked? I asked. The truth came out. I thought I'd get $600 million, so I spent all my own money. My account is empty, he admitted. What? Seriously? I was shocked. My ex-husband had been spending money he didn't even have yet. Now that we were divorced, he couldn't rely on my savings anymore, and he was currently unemployed. I finally understood why he was so panicked. Still, you have a roof over your head and a house, so you'll be fine, I said. Well, about that. He hesitated. I narrowed my eyes. Don't tell me. I already put the house up for sale. I thought I'd be moving into a luxury mansion with Dad's inheritance, so I cut him off. You what? You sold your house before you even had the money? I didn't think I'd need it anymore, and I wanted to start my new life right away, he whined. I sighed. This was beyond reckless. So, you have no savings, no income, and soon, no house? I asked. Pretty much, he admitted. I couldn't help but laugh. Oh, Richard, you really outdid yourself this time. This isn't funny. What am I supposed to do now? He snapped. Well, you can always use that $80,000, I said, but that's barely enough to cover my debts and move-in expenses. Sounds like a you problem, I replied. "You can't just leave me like this, Eleanor. We were married. You should—" I cut him off again. "We were married, past tense. You're the one who wanted a divorce, remember?" There was silence on the other end. Finally, he muttered, "Maybe we can talk things through. I mean, we did have some good times, right? Maybe I was a little rash." I smirked. "Oh, so now that you have nothing left, you suddenly remember the good times? Come on, Eleanor. Let's just meet and talk, okay?" "No thanks," I said. "I'm moving forward with my life." "But, goodbye, Richard." I hung up, took a deep breath, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. "You can rebuild your life, right?" I suggested. "I am almost 54, unemployed, and have only a little savings. What's going to happen to me? Please help me," he pleaded. "Me? You have savings and a job, don't you? Why should I help an ex-husband? You're suffering the consequences of your own actions," I said firmly. "Please, let's pretend the divorce never happened," he begged. But I ignored his pleas and hung up the phone. Having a careless personality is definitely not a good thing. With that thought, I went back to looking at property listings. Surprisingly, my ex-husband did follow through with the will and gave me $40,000 from my father-in-law's inheritance. That made up for the money he had taken from me. He probably thought it was too much trouble to fuss over $40,000 after dealing with the $600 million situation. He also apparently started working in sales again, but he didn't seem to be taking it seriously. The shock of not getting the $600 million affected his motivation, leading to frequent mistakes. After a month of struggling under the scolding of younger supervisors, he saw his paycheck and lost motivation. Comparing it to the $600 million he missed out on, he quit after just a month. Now he's a part-time worker, barely making enough to get by. With that, his savings of $600,000 won't increase. In fact, it'll probably decrease. I wonder if he's even thinking about his retirement. Well, whatever trouble he gets into now is not my concern. There's no ATM for him anymore. He'll have to work hard. I rented a small condo and started living on my own. I put the $40,000 from my father-in-law into my bank account. I consider it a kind of talisman, so I don't plan on spending it. Seeing it in the account feels like I'm carrying a bit of my father-in-law's work spirit with me, which motivates me. Today, I'll draw strength from him and do my best at work. As the weeks passed, Richard's desperation deepened. Calls from creditors piled up, each one more aggressive than the last. The luxury lifestyle he had envisioned crumbled before his eyes. One morning, he opened his email to find a final notice. A lawsuit had been filed against him for fraudulent misrepresentation regarding a business loan he secured under the assumption he would inherit millions. The dream was over. And Eleanor? She was already moving on, living a life free from his shadow.